Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So, when you're out and about, you always meet some fascinating people. And this weekend, I met a fascinating gentleman, retired General Peter Holt, who is formerly a general in the Canadian Army. And over conversation, he told me that he is an expert on Russian military. And so obviously we ended up having quite a conversation about what's going on in Ukraine and the Russian military and what he's been doing. And he's been telling me that lots of people from his former employer have been reaching out to him with some questions about what's going on the Russian front or the Ukrainian front. So General Holt, or retired General Holt, welcome to the show, sir.
I'm glad to be here, Brian, and thank you for inviting me. And I'm glad we're following up on our conversation this past weekend.
Well, I'm really looking forward to what you have to tell us. So you told me that February 24th of last year, you started having your phone ringing off the hook with people interested in your expertise.
Well, I'm a retired general. I've been keeping my hand in by doing a little bit of consulting work here and there, but I was actually thinking maybe it's time to fully, hang up the spurs type of thing. But that changed on the 24th of February, and for reasons we all understand. And I got involved in some interesting things. The first thing, as I mentioned to you last weekend, let's just say through some contacts I had in Eastern Europe, I received a pamphlet that was translated from Ukrainian, and they wanted me to check it for accuracy and send it back. And what it was a pamphlet on was how to disable a Russian tank using Molotov cocktails. And of course, I'm familiar with that. The reason I was contacted is because of the fact that I'm an expert. Well, expert. That's too strong of a word. I have studied the Russian tanks, and my master's degree is in armored vehicles, and so that was part of what I did. And that's
you
not
actually have a master's degree in armored vehicles.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
I didn't know they gave such masters. That's fascinating.
Well, it's not a very common one, and not a lot of people have it. You're right. And part of what I was studying that so I could improve our own fleets of armored vehicles, and I ended up being a project manager for various. I'm an engineer, so I ended up doing project management for various armored vehicle fleets. But that's what I used it for. And when I retired as a general, I was in charge of all of the fleets, if you would, of the Canadian Army, armored and lighter vehicles and soldiers' equipment and rifles and artillery pieces and all that. So that's what I did when I retired as a general. But my real passion is armored vehicles. So getting back to the story, my contacts in Eastern Europe sent me this stuff, and I said, well, yeah, the design of the T-62, 72, 80 series, the T-90 series of Russian tanks, they're similar. The later ones are better, but they still have some weaknesses. And so I just sort of did some corrections, and that got translated back into the language that is used over there, and I presume was distributed to a whole bunch of people.
Okay, well, I want to get into a far more detailed discussion of what's going on in Ukraine with the Russian military, etc., and your background, sir, and stuff. But just out of interest, how do you disable a Russian tank with a Molotov cocktail? It sounds like something that shouldn't be able to happen. So I presume there's some point of weakness within the Russian tank?
Yes. What you have to aim for, there are certain parts on the tank that you have to aim your Molotov cocktail. You know what a Molotov cocktail is, and
it's just alcohol in a wine bottle, isn't it?
Alcohol and sort of a liquid rubber compound, so it'll stick. So it's a little more complicated than that, but. If you went online back in February, March, you'd see that there were a lot of them being prepared and in certain parts of Ukraine, and I would probably suggest they were used. No, there are certain areas. If you look where the turret meets the chassis of the tank, there are certain spots there where you aim the Molotov cocktail, because one of the big weaknesses of that design of tank is they store the ammunition in a spot right around there. And if you are able to set fire to that part of the tank, you can end up cooking off the ammunition, which is not a good thing. Well, it's a good thing if you want to disable the tank.
Yeah.
So
this is
then
the turret, which is obviously the thing
the
that
top part.
shoots the armor.
Yeah. And there's also some weaknesses around where the engine exhausts are and where the engines. Anyway, there were pictures, I little arrows and stuff. I mean, and one, like I say, one assumes that this was used to good intent if you're Ukrainian.
I interviewed an expert from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute just yesterday on some issues in regards to Canadian defense, and he thought that our Canadian defense was not up to any kind of attack that would ever happen today. And he said we're challenged to be able to just defend ourselves from the north and keep up our NORAD obligations. What do you say to that?
Well, I have to dance around a bit on that question because I'm still, one of the things about not retiring very well is I'm an honorary colonel in serving in the Canadian Army, so I want to just be careful. Our General Wayne Eyre, the Chief of Defense Staff, who I still work for in my retirement / honorary colonel job, has said it all. He said that we have got some serious issues and we need to address them. We need improvements to, we're down on personnel thanks to the pandemic, and the recruiting program was affected, and there are equipment issues and deficiencies, and he's working on the training side. We're still trying to do our training as best as we can. And I speak for I'm involved with a reserve unit, and we're working our darndest to make sure we do our training properly. But you're right, there are deficiencies, and the commander of the Army, Joe Parle, Lieutenant General Joe Parle, who I know as well, has also said, we've got to up our game, and we've got to make sure that we take advantage of the lessons that are being learned in Ukraine and apply them to our own army. So yeah, there are deficiencies. There's a lot of very good people in uniform and on the civilian side of DND working to get them going. But your friend from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is right. Right now, we're facing a lot, and we're not alone. If you look across NATO, this is a wake-up call. What happened on the 24th of February woke up a lot of people, and the Germans, the French, our friends in the UK, there's an awful lot of people that are saying, right, this is like September 1939 when everybody had to wake up.
Everyone had to wake up. Those are pretty profound words, no question about it. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with a lot more with retired General Peter Holt, a expert in the Canadian Army when he was active, but still today in his retirement, on Russian military. We're going to take a break and be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our guest tonight is retired General Peter Holt, retired from the Canadian Army. And in his retirement, because he's an expert on Russian military, he's actually been consulted by some of his former employers and others as to what's going on in Ukraine, particularly as it relates to, obviously, Russian military capability. Before we go on to some of those issues, General Holt, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your background. So you told me they had a master's in armored vehicles. I never knew there was such a master's. Is that from like RMC or something like that?
It's a combination. I was working on some basically on a project to improve some of our existing armored vehicles, and so I was originally going to go to the Royal Military College of Science in Shrivenham.
In where?
In Shrivenham, in the United Kingdom, which is where they actually have the armored vehicle master's degree. But due to cutbacks, the Army goes through that regularly, the Canadian Forces. I ended up having to figure out how to get that expertise through a series of information from the UK, Royal Military College of Canada here in Kingston. And I was very fortunate. There were some really interesting courses at Queen's University. So I sort of knit together my own
Your own
my own
masters.
masters. Yeah, because I missed out on a nice trip for 2 years to England, but I ended up going back to my hometown of Kingston and working there. So between RMC and Queens, we were able to get the necessary courses, and I was able to get the degree that I needed, so I could continue working on armored vehicle technology.
When did you join the Army, sir?
Oh, years ago. It was in the 1960s that I joined, and I joined the
How,
Army because
how old were you?
I was 17 years old when I joined. My dad was in the Army, and my grandfather had served in the First World War, so it was a real surprise when I joined the Army, right? Not really.
My
So that's
grandfather served in the Army. Volunteered when he was, I think, 16 or 17. He was underage when he volunteered. I actually got his enlistment papers, and he lied about his age. And he was wounded on Vimy Ridge.
yes. My grandfather was there as well. Yeah. Well, there were a lot of Canadians there. Yes, and
So you joined when you were 17, and
did.
then went straight to RMC. Or tell us a little bit about your.
Well, I went to a place called Collège Militaire Royal de Saint-Jean, the CMR, which was the French military college. So, being a good English Canadian boy, I went to the province of Quebec, and it was a very good way of learning French.
I've been to that base, Sergent de Richelieu.
Yeah,
Very impressive.
yes, and that I enjoyed my time there, but because I'm an engineer, I wanted to do engineering, and the courses weren't available at CMR, so I did my last 2 years back in Kingston, doing a mechanical engineering degree there, and graduated in the early 1970s, and started my career. And one of the first places I went to was Europe, with our Cold War. I had come from Europe. My dad was posted to Germany at the time. That was our second time there. And so when I graduated, since I spoke German as well as French, they sent me back to Germany, and I worked with our 4 Canadian mechanized brigade group over there doing the NATO thing.
And does Canada have a base in Germany?
Not anymore. We did. We have Canadians on a variety of well, I must say that we do now again have a base in Latvia, because we have a battle group in Latvia as part of a response to our friend Mr. Putin.
Yeah.
So it's much smaller than what was. We had a full brigade in Lahr, and we had an air division in Baden, which is the 2 bases in Germany. So we had quite a few troops there back in the
And this was a
Cold War
mechanized.
days.
This was a mechanized division. So
Mechanized brigade group, yes.
And does that mean tanks?
That means tanks, and so yes, there were tanks there. I was involved with, again, my interest in tanks. When we first brought the Leopard tanks into the Canadian inventory in 77. I was the project officer over there. So I brought in, as a young officer, I was involved. Again, I spoke German. I was an engineer. I was dealing with bringing the original Leopard 1 tanks in. And of course, many, many years later, as a very senior officer, I was involved in the next iteration of Leopard tanks. But that was towards the end of my career rather than the beginning.
So just out of interest, tell me what you started at, and what you ended up before you retired at. What were the different titles?
Well, I started as an officer cadet, and then you go second lieutenant, lieutenant, captain, all the way through the rank. Major.
No, tell me all the ranks. I want to know all the ranks. I'm interested.
It takes a lot. So you start as an officer cadet. You don't know anything. Then you become a second lieutenant, then a lieutenant. Then you become a captain. And I was a captain when I did most of my work in 4 Brigade in the 70s in Germany, because that's kind of like a working rank. And it was the good old days. I had a a friend who was a helicopter pilot because I had to fly off to different German bases, and it was quite interesting to do that. And as a young officer, I had a great time doing that. Then I became a major. That's when I did my master's degree. Supposed to go in England. Instead, I stayed in Canada and did that. Then you become a lieutenant colonel, and I ended up back in Germany as a lieutenant colonel, commanding a unit in Lahr, Germany, where we had our base. And that was the time when the wall fell down. Not because of me, because of other circumstances, but I was commanding in Germany when the wall came down, and that was a significant event.
What was that like? If you were there as part of NATO, when the wall came down and all of a sudden people said the Cold War is over?
It was a very interesting time. We had a hard time believing it first, but then you just had to go to Berlin and see what was going on. It was shocking. And then because of course we did all of our training and exercises up against what they called the inter-German boundary and the Iron Curtain. You may have heard of that.
Yep.
And so I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen the rows of barbed wire and the watchtowers and the machine guns and the minefields and all of that. It wasn't until, November of 1989 was when the Berlin Wall fell, and that was shocking and interesting. But then when they started taking down the barbed wire fences and the demining, taking the minefields out, that was a few months later in 1990. We watched all of this and we said, I guess it is true. It was an amazing thing. We thought it was going to be there forever, that the Berlin Wall and the inter-German boundary and the Iron Curtain. So it was an interesting time to be there. And we actually started to meet with people from the Warsaw Pact, and that was intriguing. I got to say. I have some stories about that too, if you're interested.
I'd love to hear them. But let's continue on the chronology for a minute then. And so then
so after I came back to Canada, I went to the Royal Military College of Canada again to be on the staff and as a lieutenant colonel. And then I was promoted and came to Ottawa again. And this time I was I was looking after a very strange thing for an engineer. I was looking after the personnel world, the people. But that was where I ran into Russians and Warsaw Pact people again, because we started a program called Partners for Peace. Because in those days in the 90s, we said, all these ex-Warsaw Pact people, maybe they'd like to learn how to run an army in a democratic society. It was our bit of trying to say, okay, democracy seems to be what people want in Eastern Europe. Maybe we can help on the military side, because how the Russians ran their military and run it still today, and how the Warsaw Pact were organized is not the same way as democratic armies of NATO. So oddly enough,
simplistically, how's the difference? Very authoritarian, or?
I have a story for that.
Okay. Because it seems like there's a new person in charge every month or so in Russia. Yes,
there is. And there's reasons for that too. Let me explain it by very little story. Partners for Peace. So it was a good initiative. Like I say, I speak a couple of languages, and I'd spent lots of time in Europe and NATO. So when I was a colonel, I was running this program, and senior officers came from all the Warsaw Pact countries. We're talking Poland and Hungary and Romania, Bulgaria. The whole list of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And we'd be sitting there. My job was to try to explain to them, well, how do you? Because I was in charge of the sort of the military professional development and training for the Canadian military at the time. So we set up this little seminar thing, and we'd be telling them how to do things. And the basic difference, if you want to boil down the whole seminar that we had, is we trust our soldiers. We believe that We provide them orders, but we let them fulfill those orders. We don't tell them exactly how to do everything because they're trained, they're professional, and we trust them to get on with the job. We give them the direction. We give them the direction they should go in. We give them what we want them to accomplish, and then they get on with it. And we also have something very, very good, which they don't have, or they didn't have in the Warsaw Pact nations. We have senior non-commissioned officers, sergeants and warrant officers, and master and chief warrant officers. So we have that cadre of people who are there to take the orders an officer gives. Like as a commander, I'd explain what I want done. This is the mission I want you to accomplish. Here's the resources you've got to do it. Let me know if there's anything more you need. And basically, it's a little more than that. I'd give orders, but then I'd trust my soldiers to get on with it. With the Russians and the Warsaw Pact, they didn't have that level of senior non-commissioned officers in the middle. They have a lot of officers, and they've got soldiers, and the soldiers have to do exactly what they're told. No deviation, no room for initiative, no room for common sense. And that's the big weakness, and that's why they change commanders all the time. But their system is such that if you don't trust your soldiers, and let's face it, in World War II, I remember the name of that movie. It's called The Enemy at the Gate, Stalingrad.
The Enemy at the Gate, Stalingrad. It's a movie you told me that I had to watch to understand what happened in
to watch.
Stalingrad, and you're saying it's happening again today.
The Russians have not changed, and that was the shocking thing. They're still doing the same thing they did then, where basically the motivation for your soldiers, my soldiers were self-motivated. I provided them leadership and guidance. I tried to keep them focused on the mission, and we've got very good soldiers in Canada. And I'd stand back, and if I needed to apply a bit more correction, maybe I'd do it. But most of the time, I had great faith that my soldiers would do the job. The Russians, that's why they keep changing commanders. They have to order their soldiers to do everything. And it is, here's an example from our Partners for Peace. It explains. I was explaining all this how our soldiers can be developed to do their own, to accomplish the missions with just guidance and inspiration from senior officers. And all of the Hungarian, Bulgarian, all the rest of the Warsaw Pact were going, yes, and they were taking notes. The Russian colonel was sitting at the back, his arms folded. So we were all on a first name basis, which shocked some of them. And I'll call him Ivan. I won't give his real name. I said, Ivan, obviously you don't agree with my idea that with how we do things in the Canadian Army and NATO armies, how we basically, the leadership is there to set the example and the goals, and the soldiers get on with the job. And he kept shaking his head no. I said, well, Ivan, how do you do it in Russia? What is your way of doing things? And I could see some rolling eyes amongst the Hungarians, Ukrainians, and all of that. Ivan comes up to the front of the room, and we had an old blackboard there. I was using PowerPoint and stuff. You know how you do things, right? He said, you have chalk? And I said, yeah, I've got a chalk. So I gave him a piece of chalk, and he writes in big letters on the blackboard, 2 + 2 = 5. So I looked at that and looked at him. He said, in Russia, I'm the commander. I say this, 2 + 2 = 5. My soldiers say, yes, sir. What the heck do you do with that?
No one's allowed to say, but sir, it's wrong.
No. And I think that was what was getting him, because I was at the point where I said, I've been told by soldiers that I've been wrong before. And I then say, okay, then I'll have to make some changes in the orders. I can accept that.
And that would never happen in the Russian army.
And you see, that's the problem they have. Here's an example of what I did. You may have heard of the Gulf War, 1990-91, first Gulf War. I was in my unit in Lahr, and of course the NATO mission had gone down, but we were supporting the operations down there, and we were I was in charge of getting all the equipment that was needed for our troops down there, and it was transiting through LAR, and I was in charge of the operation to, anyway, it's just one of those things I did. So the mission was, we had a bunch of Hercules aircraft to ship things down, right? And the order came from Doha, Qatar. That's where we had our base, on the Gulf, Persian Gulf. The order came in. They needed more power. They wanted to have as big of generators we could find, and we had a number of them around the airfield because we used them for our NATO missions. So we had this great big 30 kilowatt generator on a trailer. Well, it was so big it couldn't fit in the back of a Herc. So you've got the colonel, a couple of majors, captain or two, all standing around, and a couple of chief warrant officers, sergeant. And I said, well, bring the corporal that fixes this things and keeps it operating. Bring him along too. Oh, yes, sir, we'll do that. All the senior leaders were standing around trying to figure out, what can we do to get this to fit in the back of that aircraft, and can we let the air out of the tires in the trailer, and all this sort of stuff. All kinds of great ideas and ingenuity. And the Corporal Tremblay from somewhere in eastern townships of Quebec. Monsieur, sir, I've got an idea. I said, yeah, Corporal, what is it? He said, well, I work on this all the time. It's mounted on a skid. All you do is dismount it from the trailer and it'll fit in the aircraft, no problem. Right. I said, Major, that's what we're going to do. Yes, sir. And that's what we did. That would never happen in the Russian army. I was wrong. All the senior leaders there were wrong because we didn't know the equipment as thoroughly as the young corporal. He was right. And, you know,
it's
in
an
our
important
army,
lesson in that, not just for the Russian army, but I think for all of us,
all of us,
in management and in life generally.
yeah, yeah.
Listen to the person who's closest to it.
And that's what's happening in Ukraine. And the Canadians, and I happen to know a few of the people that went over there doing the training, they said those soldiers listen and they pick up everything, and they're not afraid to say, hey, I've got a better idea. Whereas on the Russian side, and 2 + 2 = 5, right? And the errors in, again, armored vehicle design, which is a bit of a passion. The T-62 tank had a certain flaw. They continued it. T-72, all the latest, every model, even the more recent versions of the T-90, which is a pretty impressive tank.
These are all Russian tanks.
These are all Russian tanks. These are all the Russian tanks. I can rhyme them off because, as I say, it's a passion. They still have most of the same flaws. They fixed some of them. They armored up a couple of areas that were really a problem, but they still have flaws that they had in the original ones in the T-62. Which was what? T-62 was 1962. That was a long time ago.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes. And we're going to talk with retired General Peter Holt about what's going on in Ukraine today, what he thinks about the Russian armaments, their armed vehicles, and their military tactics. In just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having an interesting conversation tonight with Peter Holt. He is a retired general from the Canadian Army, and his expertise has been Russian military vehicles. And I met him on the weekend. And General Holt, what you were saying is that the military strategy that the Russians are making use of today are very similar, if not exactly the same, as what was taking place in World War II. Is that really true?
And that's what's surprising. I mean, I don't want to take away from any of my fellow general officers or the strategists that have been saying, well, Russia should have been able to, just with their massive strength, they should have been able to just roll over Ukraine. If the Russians had a modern military that worked like NATO militaries, the answer would have been yes, but they don't. They are were reasonably well equipped modern military, but they're using the strategy and tactics of World War II, and they have not changed because that is what they believe in. They believe in, well, here's two examples. Ukraine liberated a couple of, they liberated the area around Kharkiv and Kherson in the east and Kherson in the south. If you looked at those towns and villages and the city of Kherson that they liberated, you would see those cities were not flattened. There were actually people living in them that actually welcomed the liberators. The Russians have managed to finally, after 6 months, take one small salt mining town of Soledar. I think that's the name of it. But have you seen the pictures of that town?
There's no
There's
town
nothing left. There's no town left because the sort of the burnt earth, scorched earth, and massive artillery bombardments. That was how Russia fought in World War II. That was what they had to do, I guess, against the Germans.
So is it like a guerrilla attack versus a frontal attack?
Well, the NATO approach is to find weaknesses, exploit them, find out where the enemy's supply lines are, and stop the supplies from getting up there, so that the enemy will be forced to withdraw, and leave the city intact. We follow different. There's the Geneva Convention. There's the law of armed conflict. There's a bunch of things where you don't attack civilian infrastructure if you can avoid it. You try and find ways to force the enemy to withdraw. The Russians is just the bulldozer approach, is what I'd call it. They go straight ahead and they just pound and pound and pound until they can advance, which is what happened in World War II. There was an awful lot of that happened, but we've moved on. We don't use World War II tactics anymore.
With some of the pictures that I've seen of late, it almost looks like World War I and trench warfare.
And they've gone back to trench warfare too, which again is not something. We know how to build trenches. We still mention it. We might have the soldiers dig one just to say this is what used to happen, but it's not a. Anyway, so you've got. It's not just a dictatorship and against democracies. It's a way of thinking that, to my mind, is 70 years to 100 years old, against a more modern way of. We do not want to destroy civilian houses if we can avoid it. We want to find ways to make the enemy withdraw without destroying everything.
What's absurd to me is that I thought that Putin wanted this country to actually be part of his country and the people to become Russian people. And after you've killed half of them and destroyed their cities and destroyed everything, I don't know how you can ever expect that that you're going to occupy this land and they're actually going to become citizens of Russia. It's beyond belief. But I don't understand Putin to start with. But let me ask you about the military equipment that they've got. So we've seen lots of pictures of abandoned tanks beside the roads and things like that. What's the cause of this? Is this weak armaments, or is it lack of gas and supply, or bad tactics, or all of the above, or what?
All of the above, plus something else that they don't know, they don't do. Let me go back again to my time when I was a cold warrior facing the Russian bear in Europe. We discovered, as we went to Berlin when the wall came down, as we saw the Iron Curtain sort of being dismantled, when the Russians left, every second tank was being pulled by another vehicle, because all of those tanks lined up against us, which, if you looked at the aerial reconnaissance photographs, if you looked at all there was a lot of them there. They're such a dangerous thing. A lot of them didn't work. And the same thing happened, because one of the things the Russians don't do well and don't emphasize is supporting their equipment, supporting their troops. So when they came in from the north, heading down from Belarus, heading down to Kyiv, They didn't have enough fuel. They didn't have enough food. They didn't have an arrangements to fix anything that broke down. It was a complete shambles. One of the things, again, if you want to talk about what NATO does, we look after our troops. We make sure they're well fed. We make sure we've got enough gas for enough diesel fuel to keep the vehicles going. We do all of that unsung stuff. I mean, my unit that I command is what we call combat service support. It's there to provide all the necessary to replenish everything. I was in charge of all the mechanics that looked after the armored vehicles, all the tanks. So I made sure that my friends in the front lines had everything they needed to get the job done, and we were pushing stuff forward. The Russians, we had a push system where we made sure that we got stuff to the front. The Russians are still in the old World War II. They pull stuff forward. They make a call back saying, and because their radio systems weren't very good, they'd be calling on cell phones. Hey, I'm out of gas. Could you come pick me up? And of course, the Ukrainians would hear that. A tank there sitting out of gas. Gee, what do we do? An easy target. It was so. And again, this is not
Now,
what to do.
I've been amazed at this. That there's been so much cell phone usage that the Ukrainians can track and then exploit. What is the radio system the Ukrainians are using? It can't be tracked. That there's no way the Russians can find out how the Ukrainian divisions are operating.
They're using tactical systems. The tactical radio systems you have got a variety of it's just it doesn't work in the same frequency as cell phones. They're very difficult to detect, and they use something called burst transmission. So it goes out in short. So they're
can't find it.
Cell phones, you can't find it. I mean, that's what armies use. That's what our army uses. The first thing we do when people go to any kind of a mission, that cell phone's not going with you, my friend, because that's a dead giveaway. Cell phones are like a big beacon. You can find them anywhere. The tactical radios and
all these Ukrainian military, they don't have cell phones. Their cell phones are taken away, you think?
That's right. Yeah, because if you want to have a big beacon saying "shoot me," you have a cell phone. Yeah. So most people don't want to do that.
In the last week, President Zelensky of Ukraine has been asking for some new tanks from Canada, from Germany, elsewhere. Will these make a difference?
Of course. Of course.
Why? They're that much more modern, that much more effective?
The tanks that NATO has and they are designed specifically to exploit or to take out the Russian tanks. I mean, let's be honest. The Leopard 2, I was involved. I've been to the factory. I've seen them. I've been anyway, that's something I know pretty well. They're specifically designed to be optimized when used against Russian equipment. So they're pretty deadly, is the best way to put it. And so,
what do you think? Should Germany be giving these tanks to Ukraine?
I noticed that the defense minister in Germany was changed. I still read the German press. And the new defense minister is probably one of the more, if you could use the term, hawkish in German politics, which is really not used. Pistorius is the guy from Lower Saxony who's now the defense minister. He's been pushing all along that that Germany should support Ukraine more strongly. So there's been a change in the politics there, caused by the press. Well, no, caused by in my humble opinion, the mistakes made by the previous defense minister, who was not really in support of Ukraine as far as I'm concerned. So you know what? things have changed. The vice chancellor of Germany, again, I follow German. I go online and read German papers still to keep my language skills up. The vice chancellor of Germany, who is also someone who is a strong supporter of helping Ukraine, was just visiting Mr. Zelensky. I think things are going to change. I think there's going to be a chance because, again, for many years, Leopard tanks is what I've studied or I've worked on, and on the NATO side, I know very well. I know the Abrams as well and the Challenger, but my favorite is the Leopard for a whole bunch of reasons. And it's got the capacity to be very, very deadly. I know the Russians are saying, oh no, they'll just be, we'll take them out. Well, you know what? Just see what happens when you have Leopards going against the Russian tanks.
You know, you're talking about pretty expensive pieces of equipment. These cheap Iranian drones seem to be pretty effective. You know, how do you protect yourself against a cheap Iranian drone?
That's something that I'm just amazed. If we talk about, the Ukrainians have come up with innovative ways of doing that. I sent you that. Did you get that picture I sent you of the? It's the. I am amazed at the ingenuity that Ukraine, the soldiers in Ukraine. You see, they've got initiative and they've got ingenuity. So they strap these old anti-aircraft guns on the back of an ordinary truck. It's a real kind of, you know, Rube Goldberg type thing. But you know what? It works. Because the one thing about these Iranian drones, they are cheap, they're slow. So if you put enough bullets in the air, it's like World War II. If you have enough flak going up, it'll hit something. And oddly enough, they do things like that, and it works. And you've got to give it to them. It is just so impressive. Just like I'm not a Navy guy, I'm Army all the way. But I have Navy, an admiral friend of mine is just amazed that you can take a Sea-Doo and stick explosives on it and put a guidance system on it and send it a couple 100 kilometers to Sevastopol and blow up some Russian ships, which they did, right?
With a Sea-Doo.
With a Sea-Doo. Just nuts, right? But the thing is, you know, a Sea-Doo, nobody expects something like that bopping along in the Black Sea. And so the Russians didn't have any defense against it because it was something totally unexpected, right? But the Ukrainians said, you know what? It's below the radar. The radar systems on the Russian ships, by the way, you know where the Russian fleet ships were built? In Ukraine.
So the Ukrainians know them well.
Mykolaiv. Which is the town just next to here. They never took that. It's next to Odessa as well. That was the big shipbuilding town. That's, according to my admiral friend, that's where most of the Russian Black Sea fleet was built. So who knows them? So who knows their weaknesses? I don't know anything about ships. I'm an armored guy. But according to my admiral friend, yeah. So they were able to figure out a cheap and effective way to basically take out some very expensive Russian ships.
We're going to take a break for some final messages and come back, and I'm going to ask the general a couple of final tough questions. Stay with us, everyone. We're almost finished a really interesting interview with former General Peter Holt of the Canadian Army. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with retired General Peter Holt of the Canadian Army, who's an expert on Russian military vehicles, primarily, it sounds like tanks and armored vehicles. General, you were speaking about the 2 + 2 = 5 attitude of the Russian army, and that the Russian soldiers will only do what they're ordered. And I got to ask you, I apologize for this, sir, but I got to ask you, you know, we've had so many examples of rape and torture and terrorism and breaks of the Geneva Convention and just inhumane acts. Now, I don't know whether these are isolated or whether they're far wider than that. But it seems like they're far wider than that. Torture, in fact. If a Russian army soldier only does what he's ordered to do, are these people doing it just because they're immoral and crazy, or are they ordered to do these things, do you think?
That will be for a court of justice to decide. But my understanding, and again, I have some contacts in Eastern Europe, is that they are the Russian troops are not as well disciplined as NATO troops, and especially Canadian troops. Our troops have done some. There's a terrible case in Somalia many years ago that still resonates. But we train our troops in what they call the law of armed conflict. You don't harm people, you don't torture people, you don't, especially rape is disgusting. The Russians, on the other hand, have got a slightly different view. They have been taught, and this is something that's come that really bothers me. But the worldview of the Russian leadership is that Ukraine should be part of Russia, and they will be a part of Russia. And you know what? You can do whatever you want to them because this is almost like Mr. Adolf Hitler and the subhumans, right?
Really, the master race.
The master race. If you're the master race, what's everybody else? And that is just disgusting. But that is so is it
a cultural thing, or a learned behavior, or a ordered action?
Well, I'll switch you to the Wagner Group, who are mercenaries. Where did they recruit the Wagner Group?
Prisons
they went
and penitentiaries.
And they went to the jails and penitentiaries, and they got murderers and rapists, and they put them in uniform and gave them a rifle. How much training do you think they had? Probably not a lot. We Canadians have been accused of overtraining because we make sure our troops are well trained and disciplined. And yes, we give them a margin of maneuver to do things, but we say, this is the law of armed conflict. This is the Geneva Convention. These are the rules. War is a dirty business, but you're not to make it any dirtier.
One final quick question, sir. Yeah. Will Ukraine win?
Yes. They have the will. They have the ingenuity. They have the moral high ground as well. I mean, Napoleon said the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. They're on the right side of history in spite of what Putin says. They're the ones who are defending democracy. And I don't know if you've ever dealt with them. I think you went to Ukraine once or twice.
Yep.
They are fine people. I'm impressed by their military, where I wasn't impressed by my Russian friends. They're not friends. So yes, Ukraine will win if NATO continues to step up and give them what they need. And that's the thing that worries me. I'm not worried about Ukraine. I'm worried about NATO having the backbone to do what it said it's going to do and support them.
General Holt, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. General Holt, really appreciate it.